The stars had always called to humanity, and in the year 2347, humans had finally answered that call in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. 200 years had passed since the day humanity made first contact with alien life. And in that time, everything had changed. The United Earth Nations had grown from a single planet into a civilization spanning 40 star systems, with colonies on hundreds of worlds and moons, and trade routes that stretched across the galaxy like silver threads in the darkness of Space Admiral Ilara Vance stood on the bridge of the UN Prometheus, her flagship and the pride of the human fleet, watching the stars drift past the observation windows as her ship patrolled the border of human space. She was a tall woman with gray streaks in her dark hair, and her uniform bore the medals of 30 years of service to humanity. She had seen much in those 30 years, but she had never seen war, not real war. Not the kind that consumed worlds and ended civilizations. The Galactic Concordat had prevented that. A treaty signed by 12 spacefaring species that promised peace and cooperation among all its members. Humanity had been the last to join the Concordat, the youngest species to reach the stars, and many of the older races had looked upon them with suspicion and doubt. Could these newcomers be trusted to honor the ancient laws that kept the peace? But humans had proven themselves worthy of the Concordat's trust, or so Ilara believed. They had followed every rule, honored every agreement, and built a reputation as honest traders and reliable partners. The Valith Dominion had never shared that view. Ilara thought about the Valith as she watched the stars, and a cold feeling settled in her stomach. They were an ancient race, older than humanity by 40,000 years. And they had built an empire that spanned 200 star systems. Before humans had even learned to make fire, the Valith were crystalline beings, their bodies made of living mineral that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows. And they were beautiful in a cold and terrible way. But beneath that beauty lay an arrogance that Ilara had sensed from the first moment she met them. They did not see humans as equals. She knew. They saw them as children playing at being adults, newcomers who had stumbled into a galaxy they did not understand and could never truly belong to. Ambassador Kethril was the worst of them, a Valith diplomat who smiled with his crystalline face while his words dripped with contempt. He had come to Earth just last month to reaffirm the Treaty of Velos Prime, the specific agreement between humanity and the Valith Dominion that guaranteed peace between their peoples. Ilara had attended that ceremony, standing in her dress uniform as Kethril spoke beautiful words about friendship and cooperation, and she had felt nothing but unease. Something in his voice had seemed wrong, something in the way his crystal eyes had glittered as he looked upon the human delegates, but she had pushed those feelings aside, telling herself that she was being paranoid, that the Concordat had kept the peace for centuries and would continue to do so for centuries more now. Standing on her bridge in the cold silence of space, she wondered if she had been a fool. Her first officer, Commander James O'Conkle, approached her with a datapad in his hand, and his dark face was creased with concern. "Admiral, we have received a strange report from the colony of New Eden," he said. And his voice was quiet but tense. Ilara turned to face him, her heart beginning to beat faster in her chest. New Eden was one of humanity's largest colonies, a beautiful world of green forests and blue oceans that was home to more than 4 million people. "What kind of report?" she asked. James handed her the datapad, and his hand trembled slightly as he did so. "Long-range sensors have detected a large fleet approaching the system," he said, "and the ships match the signature of Valith warships." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face as she read the data on the screen. The report showed at least 200 Valith vessels moving toward New Eden at high speed, their weapons systems active and their shields raised. "This must be a mistake," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were not true. "Contact the Valith embassy and demand an explanation." James nodded and hurried to the communication station. But Alara already knew what the answer would be. There would be no explanation, no apology. No misunderstanding to clear up. The Valith had made their choice far across the galaxy. On the green and peaceful world of New Eden, Governor Marcus Chen was enjoying dinner with his family when the first alarms began to sound. His wife looked up from her plate with fear in her eyes, and his 2 young children stopped eating and stared at him with confusion. "What is that noise, Papa?" his daughter asked, and Marcus felt his heart break as he looked at her innocent face. He did not have time to answer before the sky outside their window turned white. And the last thing Marcus Chen ever saw was the faces of the people he loved most in the universe. The Valith had come to New Eden not to conquer, but to destroy. Not to claim, but to annihilate. And in 6 terrible hours they reduced a thriving world to ash and glass and silence. 4,200,000 human beings died that day, burned away by weapons that should never have been used against the innocent. And the galaxy would never be the same again on the bridge of the Prometheus. Admiral Alara Vance received the final transmission from New Eden 11. Seconds of screaming and static before the signal cut off forever, and she felt something inside her die. Along with those 4 million souls, she had spent her whole life believing in peace, trusting in treaties, hoping that civilized beings could solve their differences without violence. Now she understood how naive she had been. The Valith had broken the Pact, and humanity would make them pay. The news of New Eden spread across human space like fire through dry grass. And everywhere it touched, it left grief and rage in its wake on Earth. In the great chamber of the United Earth Nations, President Yuki Tanaka sat at the head of a long table surrounded by admirals and generals and diplomats. And the silence in the room was heavier than any words could ever be. She was a small woman with silver hair and kind eyes. But those eyes were not kind anymore. They were hard and cold and filled with a fury that burned like the heart of a star. The holographic display in the center of the table showed what remained of New Eden, a world of black glass and gray ash where green forests and blue oceans had existed just 1 day before. And every person in the room stared at it without speaking. 4,200,000 dead, the report said. And the number was so large that it seemed impossible to comprehend. How could anyone truly understand what 4 million deaths meant? President Tanaka thought of the children who had died on that world, the families who had been eating dinner or playing games or sleeping in their beds when the fire came down from the sky, and she felt something inside her chest turn to ice. "The Valith have sent a message," said Foreign Minister David Eulerin, his voice barely above a whisper. "They demand that we accept our place in the galactic order and submit to their authority, or they will destroy more of our worlds." A murmur of shock and anger rippled through the room. And Admiral Vance, who had arrived on Earth just hours ago, slammed her fist against the table. "They murdered 4 million people, and now they demand our surrender," she shouted, and her voice cracked with grief and rage. "They think we will bow down and accept this?" President Tanaka raised her hand for silence, and the room fell quiet once more. "What do the other Concordat races say?" she asked, and her voice was calm, even though her heart was screaming. Minister Eulerin shook his head with disgust on his face. "Nothing," he said. "They express regret and concern, but they will not act against the Valith. They are too afraid, too comfortable, too unwilling to risk their own peace for our dead." President Tanaka nodded slowly, and something in her expression made everyone in the room hold their breath. They had never seen their president look like this before, had never seen this cold and terrible light in her eyes. "The Valith believe they know who we are," she said, and her voice was soft but carried to every corner of the chamber. They believe we are soft and weak and afraid, that we will accept any insult and swallow any injury to avoid conflict. She stood up from her chair and walked to the holographic display, reaching out to touch the image of the ruined world with her fingertips. "They are wrong," she said. "They have made a mistake that their civilization will not survive." The room was completely silent now, every eye fixed on the small woman standing before the image of death and destruction. "Wake the Reapers," President Tanaka said. And those 3 words changed the course of galactic history deep beneath the surface of Earth. In bunkers that had been sealed for 100 years, machines began to stir. In hidden bases scattered throughout asteroid fields and empty moons, ships that had never flown before powered up their engines for the first time. In secret laboratories, where scientists had worked in silence for generations, weapons that the galaxy had banned long ago were loaded onto transport vessels. Humanity had always hoped that this day would never come, had prayed that the Reapers would never need to wake, but they had prepared for it nonetheless. They had learned long ago that hope was not a strategy, that peace required strength, and that sometimes the only way to prevent war was to be so terrifying that no one would dare start one. The Valith had dared, and now they would learn the truth about the species they had thought so weak. Admiral Vance was given command of the first retaliation fleet. 247 warships crewed by men and women who had lost friends and family on New Eden. And she stood on the bridge of the Prometheus as her fleet assembled around her. "Admiral," said Commander Okonkwo, and his voice was steady despite the grief that showed on his face. "The fleet is ready. What are your orders?" Alara looked out at the stars, at the darkness that had once seemed so full of wonder and promise, and she felt the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her shoulders. She thought of Marcus Chun, the governor of New Eden, a good man she had met several times at diplomatic functions. She thought of his wife and his children, whose names she did not know, but whose faces she imagined burned into ash by Valith weapons. "Set course for Valith space," she said, and her voice did not waver. "We are going to teach them what it means to break faith with humanity across the galaxy." The Valith High Council received reports that the humans were mobilizing, and they laughed at the news. What could the humans possibly do against an empire that had ruled 200 star systems for 40,000 years? They had thousands of warships, millions of soldiers, resources beyond counting, and technology beyond imagining. The humans had less than 300 ships and a few dozen colony worlds. It would not even be a war, the Valith believed. It would be a lesson, a demonstration of the proper order of things, a reminder to the young species that they should know their place. They were so confident in their superiority that they did not bother to prepare defenses for their outer systems, did not think to protect the agricultural worlds that fed their empire, did not imagine that the humans would do anything other than attack their military targets in a futile gesture of defiance. That confidence would cost them everything. The first retaliation fleet crossed into Valith space on a cold morning in March, and the galaxy held its breath. Admiral Alara Vance stood on the bridge of the Prometheus, watching the tactical display as her ships moved through the darkness like wolves hunting prey. And she felt no joy in what she was about to do, only a grim determination that burned in her chest like a dying star. Other races of the Galactic Concordat watched from afar, shocked and confused by what they were seeing. They had expected the humans to attack the Valith military, to fight battles in space and struggle against impossible odds, to die bravely in a war they could not win. Instead, the human fleet bypassed the Valith armada entirely. "Admiral, the Valith Third Fleet is moving to intercept us," Commander Okonkwo reported, his eyes fixed on his console. "They will reach our position in 12 hours. Alara nodded but did not change course. "Let them come," she said. "We will be finished before they arrive." The first target was not a military base or a shipyard. or a weapons factory. It was a planet called Velketh, a world of golden fields and silver rivers that produced food for 100 Valeth systems. The people of Velketh had never held weapons, had never served in the military, had never done anything except grow crops and tend their farms. They were innocent of the crimes committed against New Eden. And Alara knew this with absolute certainty. She also knew that the Valeth High Council had known exactly what they were doing when they burned New Eden, had understood that they were killing children and families and farmers, just like the ones who lived on Velketh, and had done it anyway. Launch the kinetic bombardment, she ordered, and her voice was as cold as the void between stars. From the bellies of her warships, thousands of tungsten rods fell toward Velketh, accelerating to tremendous speeds as they dropped through the atmosphere. When they struck the surface, each one carried the force of a nuclear explosion. And within an hour, the golden fields had become black craters and the silver rivers had turned to steam. No one died on Velketh. The humans had given warning before the attack, had broadcast evacuation orders that allowed the population to flee, but the food that would have fed 100 worlds was gone. Destroyed in a single morning, the Valeth High Council received the news with disbelief and fury, and they sent a message to Admiral Vance demanding an explanation. Her response was broadcast across every frequency in Valeth space, so that every citizen of the Dominion could hear her words. "You killed our children," she said, and her face on the view screens was as hard as stone. "You burned our world and laughed at our grief. You thought we would bow down and accept your cruelty because we are young and you are old." She leaned forward, and her eyes seemed to burn with a fire that made even the bravest Valeth commanders look away. "You were wrong," she said. "There will be no negotiation. There will be no mercy. There will be no end to this war until your civilization lies in ruins and your children's children remember the name of New Eden with fear and shame." The transmission ended, and silence fell across Valeth space in the halls of the Galactic Concordat. The other races watched in horror as the humans continued their campaign of destruction. They had never seen anything like this before, had never imagined that the young and peaceful humans were capable of such systematic violence. Ambassador Kethril, the Valeth diplomat who had smiled and spoken of friendship just weeks before, demanded that the Concordat intervene and stop the human aggression. "They are committing war crimes," he declared, his crystalline body flashing with angry light. "They are attacking civilian targets and destroying our ability to feed our people. This is barbarism. This is savagery. This is everything the Concordat was created to prevent." The Concordat's response came from an unexpected source, Ambassador Sarah Chun, the sister of Marcus Chun, the governor who had died on New Eden. She was a small woman with dark hair and eyes that held a grief so deep it seemed bottomless. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 4 million souls. "You speak of barbarism?" she asked, and her words were soft but cut like knives. "You speak of savagery? Let me tell you what savagery looks like." She activated a holographic display that showed the final moments of New Eden, the ships appearing in the sky, the weapons firing, the cities burning, the people screaming as they died. "My brother Marcus was eating dinner with his family when your ships came," she said. "His daughter was 8 years old. His son was 5. They died in fire because your people decided that humanity needed to be taught a lesson." She turned to face Ambassador Kethril, and the Valeth diplomat actually stepped backward from the fury in her eyes. "You watched as we were murdered," she said. "All of you watched, and you did nothing. You invoked no sanctions. You offered no aid. You made no attempt to stop the slaughter. Now you ask us for mercy?" Her voice rose until it filled the chamber like thunder. "Mercy died on New Eden," she declared. "We offered peace, and you answered with genocide. We trusted your words, and you proved them worthless. Now you will learn what happens when humanity stops hoping and starts fighting." She walked out of the chamber without looking back, and no one tried to stop her in Veil's space. Admiral Vance continued her campaign with merciless efficiency. Shipyards were destroyed, fuel depots were sabotaged, communication relays were reduced to debris, and one by one, the systems that kept the Veilith Dominion functioning began to fail. The Veilith military tried to stop her, sending fleet after fleet to hunt down the human ships, but Alara was always one step ahead. She knew they expected her to fight, so she refused to fight. She struck where they were weak, retreated when they were strong, and bled their empire dry without ever giving them the decisive battle they craved. The war had only begun, but the Veilith were already losing. 18 months had passed since the massacre of New Eden, and the Veilith Dominion was dying. Admiral Alara Vance stood in the war room of the Prometheus, surrounded by holographic maps that showed the collapse of an empire, and she felt nothing but exhaustion. The anger that had burned so bright in those first terrible days had faded into something colder, something harder, something that kept her moving forward even when she wanted to stop. The maps told the story of humanity's vengeance in cold blue lines and red warning symbols. Of the 200 star systems the Veilith had once ruled, only 70 remained under their control, and those were crumbling faster every day. Food shortages had spread across their worlds as the destruction of their agricultural planets took its toll. Ships sat idle in ports without fuel to fly. Messages went undelivered as communication networks fell silent. And everywhere the people of the Dominion looked, they saw the evidence of their empire's end. "Admiral, we have intercepted a transmission from the Veilith High Council," Commander Okonkwo said, and his voice was tired. "They are requesting a meeting to discuss terms." Alara turned to face him, and her eyes were shadowed with weariness. "What terms?" she asked. Okonkwo shook his head slowly. "They wish to negotiate a ceasefire," he said. "They are offering to return to the borders that existed before the attack on New Eden and pay compensation for the lives lost." For a long moment, Alara said nothing. She thought of Marcus Chun and his family, of the 4 million people who had died screaming as fire fell from the sky, of the children who would never grow up, and the parents who would never grow old. "No," she said finally. "That is not enough." She walked to the main display and pulled up an image of Veilith Prime, the homeworld of the Dominion, a planet of towering crystal spires and ancient monuments that had stood for 40,000 years. "They thought they could murder our people and then apologize their way back to peace," she said. "They thought that we would accept money for the blood of our children. They still do not understand what they have done." She turned to face her senior officers, and her expression was carved from stone. "We will continue the campaign until they surrender unconditionally," she said. "We will accept nothing less than complete disarmament, total reparations, and the arrest and execution of every military commander responsible for the New Eden massacre." "Admiral," said Captain Lisa Yamamoto, her voice hesitant, "the other Concordat races are pressuring Earth to accept the ceasefire. They say that we have made our point and that further war serves no purpose." Alara laughed, and the sound was bitter and cold. "They watched 4 million of our people die and did nothing," she said. "They have no right to tell us when our justice is complete." She issued her orders, and the campaign continued across Veilith space. Human ships appeared without warning, striking targets and vanishing before the enemy could respond. Factories that had produced weapons for 10,000 years were reduced to rubble. Research facilities that held the secrets of ancient technology were burned to ash. And the proud crystalline cities that had once gleamed like jewels in the darkness of space grew dark and silent. Veilith people began to starve as the last of their food reserves ran out. and riots erupted in their streets as citizens demanded that their government do anything to stop the human onslaught, but there was nothing the Valith could do. Their fleet was scattered and leaderless. Their supply lines were cut, their allies had abandoned them, and the humans seemed to be everywhere at once, striking from the shadows like ghosts of the dead on Valith Prime. The High Sovereign Kethvern sat in his throne room and stared at the reports of disaster with eyes that no longer held any hope. He had ruled the Dominion for 300 years, had guided his people through wars and plagues and natural disasters, but he had never faced anything like this. His advisors told him that the humans were demons, monsters without mercy or conscience, but Kethvern knew the truth. The humans were not monsters. They were a mirror, reflecting back the cruelty that the Valith had shown them. "We did this to ourselves," he whispered, and his crystalline body flickered with grief. "We broke the pact. We murdered the innocent. We thought we could act without consequence because we were old and powerful and feared." He thought of Ambassador Kethral, who had gone to Earth to reaffirm the treaty while Valith warships were already on their way to New Eden. He thought of the admirals who had ordered the attack, confident that the humans would submit. He thought of himself, who had approved the operation believing it would teach the young species their place. "We were fools," he said, "and now our children will pay the price for our arrogance." A warning alarm sounded throughout the palace, and Kethvern looked up to see human ships appearing in the sky above his world, hundreds of them, more than had ever gathered in one place during the entire war. Admiral Vance's face appeared on every view screen in the Dominion, and her voice was calm and cold as she delivered humanity's final ultimatum. "Unconditional surrender," she said. "Complete disarmament of all military forces. Payment of reparations to be determined by the United Earth Nations. And the arrest and transfer of all military commanders who participated in the planning or execution of the New Eden massacre." She paused, and her eyes seemed to look directly at the High Sovereign. "You have 1 hour to accept these terms," she said. "If you refuse, we will demonstrate what humanity is truly capable of. Choose wisely." The transmission ended, and Kethvern sat in silence as his advisors shouted and argued around him. Some demanded that he fight to the last, that he preserve the honor of the Dominion, even in defeat. Others begged him to surrender, to save what remained of their people. The High Sovereign thought of honor and pride and the legacy of 40,000 years, and he made his decision. "We refuse," he declared. "We will not bow to these barbarians. We will fight until the end." Admiral Vance received his answer, and she nodded slowly. "So be it," she said. What followed the High Sovereign's refusal was not a battle. It was the end of a world. Admiral Elara Vance stood on the bridge of the Prometheus and watched as the Prometheus protocol was activated. And for the first time since the war began, she felt something other than cold determination. She felt fear, not of the enemy, but of what her own species had created. The Prometheus protocol was humanity's darkest secret, a weapon designed in hidden laboratories by scientists who had hoped it would never be used. It was a swarm of self-replicating drones, machines so small they were nearly invisible, programmed to consume technology and use the raw materials to make more of themselves. Within hours of the protocol's activation, the drones had spread across Valith Prime like a plague. They ate through the factories that produced ships and weapons, devoured the power plants that lit the cities, consumed the communication towers that connected the planet to the rest of the Dominion. The Valith tried to fight back, tried to destroy the drones with fire and electricity and radiation. But for every drone they killed, 100 more were born. The swarm was relentless, unstoppable, and utterly without mercy. But the drones were not the worst weapon humanity had brought to Valith Prime. Deep beneath the surface of the planet lay the Valith Nexus, a network of crystalline structures that connected every Valith mind to every other. It was the heart of their civilization, the source of their collective consciousness, the thing that made them a single unified people rather than billions of isolated individuals. Human scientists had studied the Nexus for years, had learned its secrets and discovered its weaknesses, and they had designed a weapon specifically to exploit them. "Admiral," said Commander Okonkwo, his voice quiet. "The severance device is ready." Alara closed her eyes for a moment, and she thought of the person she had been before New Eden, a woman who believed in peace, who trusted in treaties, who hoped that civilized beings could solve their differences without violence. That woman was gone, burned away along with 4 million innocent souls. And in her place stood something harder and colder and more terrible. "Activate the device," she said. The severance device was fired into the heart of the Nexus, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The crystalline network that had connected Valith minds for 40,000 years shattered into billions of fragments. And across the planet, across the entire Dominion, every Valith felt themselves suddenly and horribly alone. They screamed not with their voices, but with their minds, as the connection that had defined their existence was ripped away. Some went mad in that instant, unable to bear the silence where a billion voices had once sung. Others simply collapsed, their bodies shutting down as their minds struggled to process the trauma of Valith Dominion, which had ruled 200 star systems for 40 millennia. Collapsed in a single day ships, drifted without crews as their pilots sat frozen in their seats, unable to function without the guidance of the collective. Cities fell silent as their inhabitants wandered the streets like ghosts, reaching out for minds that would never answer. And on Valith Prime, the High Sovereign Kethvern sat alone in his throne room and wept crystal tears for everything his people had lost. Admiral Vance watched the chaos unfold on her view screens, and she felt no triumph, only a hollow emptiness that seemed to fill her chest where her heart had once been. "It is done," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Send the message to Earth. The war is over." In the months that followed, humanity occupied what remained of Valith space. The surviving Valith were scattered and broken, unable to organize or resist, and they accepted whatever terms the humans offered without complaint. The military commanders responsible for the New Eden massacre were arrested and tried before a tribunal of human judges. Their defense that they had simply been following orders, that they had not known civilians would die, that they had believed the humans would surrender was rejected, and they were executed one by one in public ceremonies broadcast across the galaxy. The other races of the Galactic Concordat watched in stunned silence as humanity reshaped the balance of power that had existed for thousands of years. They had always thought of humans as newcomers, as children who needed guidance and protection. But now they understood how wrong they had been. Ambassador Sarah Chun addressed the Concordat Assembly one final time, her voice carrying across the chamber like the tolling of a bell. "We came to the stars seeking friends," she said. "We found them in many of you, and we hope to find more in the years to come. But let this serve as a warning to all who might think of breaking faith with humanity." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates from a dozen different species. "We do not start wars," she said. "We finish them. Attack our people, and we will respond not with proportional force, but with absolute force. Break your word to us, and your children's children will speak of your empire in the past tense." She walked out of the chamber, and no one spoke as she left. Admiral Alara Vance retired from the military 1 year after the war ended. She declined the medals and honors that Earth tried to give her, refused the invitations to speak at universities and memorials, and disappeared to a quiet colony world on the edge of human space. She spent her days tending a small garden and watching the stars at night. And she tried not to think about the things she had done. A journalist found her 3 years later and asked if she regretted the war, if she felt guilty for the destruction of Veil's civilization, if she would do anything differently, if she could go back. Alara sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the horizon where the sun was setting in shades of orange and red. They made a choice, she said finally. They chose to murder our children. They chose to break the pact that kept us at peace. They chose to believe that we were too weak to respond. She turned to look at the journalist, and her eyes were tired and sad and very, very old. So we made a choice too, she said. History will judge us both. I have made my peace with that. In the grand archives of the Galactic Concordat, a new entry was added to humanity's official file, a single word that would define how the galaxy saw them for generations to come. The word was simple, but its meaning was clear to everyone who read it. Dangerous and on Earth. In a memorial garden built where the United Nations had once stood, a wall of black stone bore the names of every person who had died on New Eden. At the top of the wall, carved in letters of gold, was an inscription that would remind humanity forever of what they had lost and what they had become. They thought us weak because we sought peace. They learned too late that we sought peace because we knew what we were capable of. The stars still called to humanity, and humanity still answered. But now the galaxy listened with respect, with caution, and with fear.